Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something that's causing a lot of controversy right now,
Yeah,
the 287G program.
it's uh it's definitely a hot topic and a complex one.
It is, and just to give everyone like a really basic overview, this program allows local law enforcement to get involved in federal immigration enforcement.
Right, and I think it's important to kind of start with the fact that it's not actually a new program.
Right.
It's been around for decades, actually.
It has been around since the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really getting a lot of attention again because President Trump is really pushing for its expansion.
Exactly, and that's why we're seeing this kind of renewed debate about, what is the role of local law enforcement in these federal immigration matters.
Right. And that's a big question. We've got a whole bunch of sources here, articles, reports, legal analyses, and they're all grappling with this issue.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one because there are strong arguments on both sides. On the one hand, you have people saying, look, we need to enforce our immigration laws and local law enforcement should be part of that.
Uh-huh.
But on the other hand, you have concerns about, racial profiling,
Yeah.
overreach, the potential for abuse.
The impact on communities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to untangle all of that.
We are going to get into all of it, and I think a good place to start is with this case in Hamilton County, Indiana.
Okay.
Their sheriff's office really wants to join this 287G program, but they couldn't get approval during the Biden administration.
Right.
So now, with Trump back in office, they're seeing an opportunity.
Interesting.
It is.
So can I just clarify something here about the 287G program?
Yeah.
Because there are actually two different models.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the first one requires 4 weeks of training for the officers, and it lets them question and detain people suspected of being in the country illegally.
Oh, okay.
But there's a catch.
Okay.
This only applies to people who are already in jail for other reasons.
So they're already in the system.
Exactly. So Hamilton County wants to use this model, the one with more training, but also more authority for their officers within the jail.
Okay, that makes sense. And then what's the other model?
So the second one only requires 8 hours of training, and it's much more limited.
Okay.
It's focused solely on serving federal immigration warrants.
Gotcha.
But here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Trump's borders are Tom Homan. He wants to go even further.
He does.
He's talking about bringing back this model that allows local task forces to actually make arrests on the street.
Wait, hold on. So local police could be stopping anyone on the street just to check their immigration status?
That's the idea, and it's something that President Obama actually discontinued because of those concerns about racial profiling.
Yeah. I mean, how do you even safeguard against bias in that kind of scenario?
Right, that's the big question. And to be honest, the legality and the limits of this potential expansion,
Yeah.
they're really unclear right now.
It sounds like a recipe for a lot of potential problems.
It definitely raises some serious concerns about civil liberties and due process.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just about Homan's ideas either. Like,
Yeah.
we're seeing some states really pushing the boundaries of this program, too.
Yeah, what do you have in mind?
Well, take Florida, for example. Governor DeSantis just made this deal with ICE,
Okay.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Yeah.
It allows the Florida Highway Patrol to actually detain immigrants who they suspect of being in the country illegally.
Wow.
Yeah, and DeSantis is framing this as part of like the biggest deportation program in American history.
So it seems like some states are really doubling down on this idea of using local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration law?
They are, but this isn't a brand new idea either.
Right.
Like, this program has a history.
It does, and not all of it is good.
Yeah, and that brings us back to those concerns about racial profiling. Like, do you remember what happened in Maricopa County, Arizona back in 2011?
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal.
It was a huge deal.
The 287G program was actually shut down there after a Justice Department investigation found evidence of racial profiling by sheriff's deputies.
Yeah, it's a really stark reminder of how these programs can go wrong.
It definitely is, and it raises the question of, how do we make sure that history doesn't repeat itself?
Especially when you have states like Florida and Georgia pretty much mandating participation in these ICE programs.
Yeah, they're saying it's all about public safety, but is it really?
Right, because Florida now requires all agencies with county jails to either join 287G or explain why they can't.
Wow, that's a pretty strong stance.
It is. And then in Georgia, they passed a similar law after a student was murdered, allegedly, by someone in the country illegally.
So it seems like these high-profile cases are really fueling this push to expand the program.
They are. And then you have people like Texas Representative David Spiller, who's pushing for mandatory participation nationwide. And he even authored a law that allows any officer to arrest migrants suspected of illegal entry, although that one's being challenged in court.
It's a lot of...
It feels like we're seeing this real shift towards giving local law enforcement a much bigger role in immigration enforcement.
And it's not without its critics.
Definitely not. Like Democratic Senator Rodney Pohl from Indiana, he's arguing that these programs are actually going to strain local resources and that they could lead to more racial profiling and that they're going to erode community trust in law enforcement.
Yeah, those are all valid concerns.
They are. I mean, think about it. If people are afraid to report crimes because they're worried about being deported,
Right.
that actually makes everyone less safe.
Absolutely. It undermines the whole idea of public safety.
And it's interesting because even within law enforcement, there's no clear consensus on this issue.
Yeah, that's right. Like, take Sheriff Kieran Donahue in Idaho, for example.
Okay.
He actually supports the idea of the 287G program,
Okay.
but he says he won't participate because he doesn't have the manpower or the jail space to make it work.
Right. So even among law enforcement, there are these practical concerns.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's go back to Hamilton County for a second. Okay. Their chief deputy, John Lowe's, he's arguing that they need 287G because a lot of the people booked into their jail are non-citizens.
Interesting.
And he points to charges ranging from DUI and drug possession to even like sexual battery.
So he's making the case that it's a public safety issue.
Yes.
But of course, we don't know exactly how many of those people are actually in the country illegally.
Right.
So it kind of fuels that debate.
It does, because at the end of the day, it's about trying to balance these competing interests, public safety versus the potential for overreach and discrimination.
Right, and that's really the heart of this whole 287G debate.
It is. It's a really complex issue, and it's one that we're going to keep unpacking in this deep dive.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to explore here.
We've got the resurgence of this program, the arguments for and against its expansion, and these very real concerns about profiling and the impact on communities.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is, but I think it's really important that we have these conversations and that we really try to understand all sides of this issue.
I agree.
So stick with us as we continue our deep dive into the 287G program.
Yeah, it really is fascinating, isn't it, how a program that's supposed to be about public safety can be so controversial.
It is. I mean, we've been talking about how 287G basically gives local officers the power to act like immigration agents, but like, what does that actually look like in practice?
Right. So when a local police department decides to join this program, they have specially trained officers who can then question people about their immigration status.
Right, but how do they even know, like, right then and there if someone's in the country legally or not?
That's a good point, because it's not always that simple.
Right.
You know, there's the risk of mistaken identity or misinterpreting documents, and there's always the potential for abuse of power.
I was just thinking about that too. Like, even with programs that have good intentions, sometimes they can be used to unfairly target certain communities.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can't really ignore the history here.
Right.
Immigration enforcement in this country has a long and complicated past, and it's often been intertwined with discrimination and prejudice.
So how do we make sure that 287G doesn't just become another tool for that kind of thing?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yes.
There are training programs and guidelines in place, but critics say that they're not always enough. And I think it's also really important to consider the perspective of the officers themselves.
Yeah, like I imagine it's got to be a tough position to be in.
It is. They're sworn to uphold the law, but they're also part of the communities that they serve.
Right.
So they might feel conflicted,
Yeah.
between their duty to enforce immigration laws
Yeah.
and their desire to maintain trust and good relationships with everyone in their community.
And what if, like, implementing this program actually makes some people in the community feel less safe?
Right.
Like less likely to report crimes or talk to the police because they're afraid of being deported?
That's a real concern. And if that happens, then it kind of defeats the whole purpose of public safety.
Right. It becomes a vicious cycle.
It does.
So you're saying that 287G could actually make communities less safe because it erodes trust and creates this barrier between law enforcement and the people they're supposed to protect.
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
And there are also practical concerns to think about, like the cost of implementing this program.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like the training, housing detainees, all the paperwork.
Exactly. All of that adds up, and somebody has to pay for it.
The taxpayers.
Right. And that raises another question, like, is this really the best way to use those resources? Could that money be better spent on other crime prevention programs or community initiatives?
Right. And from what I've been reading, there are also concerns about transparency and accountability with this program.
Hmm.
Like I've seen reports about inconsistent training standards
Yeah.
and a lack of data to really track how effective the program actually is.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Mm,
We need more oversight to make sure that 287G is
yeah.
being implemented fairly and justly.
Right. And without clear metrics and accountability, it's really hard to know what kind of impact it's having and whether it's actually working.
Exactly.
Wow. It feels like we've just scratched the surface here with this 287G program.
I know, right? There's just so much to consider, so many different angles.
Yeah, we've covered the history, the legal stuff, the arguments for and against expanding it, the profiling issue, the impact on trust in communities.
Yeah.
But, like, at the end of the day, I keep thinking about the people you know.
Right.
We're not just talking about policies here, we're talking about actual human beings whose lives are being turned upside down by this program.
Absolutely. We can't forget about the human side of this.
Yeah.
You know, the fear, the uncertainty, all the anxiety that so many immigrants are dealing with because of 287G.
Hmm.
Can you imagine living with that constant worry that even a simple traffic stop could end up with you being detained or even deported?
It's a lot. And it's not just undocumented immigrants either. Even people who are here legally, they could still face scrutiny or harassment just because of their race or how they look.
Exactly. And that feeds into those concerns about racial profiling.
Uh-huh.
When you give law enforcement that much power to question people about their immigration status, it can lead to bias and discrimination.
It's hard to ignore those historical parallels, you know?
I know.
Like we've seen how programs like this can be used to target specific communities in the past.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to have these discussions, to
Mm-hmm.
really scrutinize these programs and hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. So, like, where do we go from here? I
Right.
mean, we've talked about how complex this issue is, and we've heard arguments from both sides, and we've seen how things can go wrong.
Hmm.
So, what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that this isn't a simple issue.
Yeah.
There are valid points on both sides of the debate,
Uh-huh.
and ultimately it comes down to what kind of society we want to build.
Okay.
Do we want to prioritize security above everything else?
Yeah.
Or do we want to find a balance between security and compassion and respecting everyone's rights?
Those are some big questions.
They are. And we don't have all the answers.
Right.
But hopefully this deep dive has given you the information and the tools to start forming your own opinion.
Absolutely. And this is an ongoing conversation, you know?
Right.
Talk to your friends, your family, your community leaders, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.
Because ultimately, the choices we make about immigration enforcement are going to have a huge impact on our country.
Yeah, they will. Well, hey, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the 287G program.
It's been great talking about this with you.
It has. We'll see you next time.